Hi, Anthony.
Yellow, how you doing?
I'm okay. I'm just going to stay on mute for a bit because I'm sorting out a passport for my friend.
Sure, no problem.
Nice one. Talk to you in a bit.
Yeah.
Change. The culture of the workplace. The toxic culture of the workplace, the racist culture of the workplace, the sexist culture of the workplace, but culture thrown around, as I say, in all kinds of senses. Not to mention that curious sense in which we use it to mean somebody whose educational background we approve of. A cultured person, a cultivated person, a man or woman of culture. So trying to find something in common between all these uses is a major challenge. And part of what I'm offering then is a very inferior and belated footnote to that remarkable work by T.S. Eliot, Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, published in a very, very different world in 1948. As everybody agrees, it's a work that has dated and not aged all that well. And yet, reading it through, there are moments where at least you sense that Eliot is asking the right kind of questions, that he is, in fact, prompting us to do some hard work on concepts and ideas, and for his time, making some rather remarkable observations and insights which are still worth sitting with. And so in my reflections on the meaning of the word, some of it will be a little bit in dialogue with Eliot's work. But let's start with one basic observation. When we talk about sharing a culture of any kind, what we most obviously mean is that we are in an environment we recognize. Culture is about the tools of recognition, the signs that we can decode, the guarantees of shared interest, possibly shared background, and possibly shared purpose. The pattern of a life whose rhythm we can share and understand. An environment that has a certain number of heroes and saints in common. We have stories that we share about the lives that we believe to be in some way authoritative for us. And Eliot himself, rather wonderfully, says that one of the things that builds a culture is the forms of festivity. In other words, what and how do we celebrate? How do we relax? Interesting that he makes that observation in the context of talking about the culture of a workplace, which he says is not just about the work being done, but also about what punctuates that work or interrupts it, the forms of festivity, the means of unwinding together. So if culture is fundamentally something to do with how we learn to recognize others, the next question is, why do we need to? What is recognition for? What's it about? At the most basic level, this is rather like the questions we ask about language itself. we need to develop means of recognition, guarantees of being understood, partly because we naturally, necessarily, do things together. And in working together, in creating together, acting in concert and in consort, we need those assumptions. What I'm doing, what I'm saying, will make sense to you. If I prompt you to do something, I need to know that you'll understand what it is I'm asking. But it runs much deeper than just that functional level, because that mutual recognition is also one of the things that reinforces a sense of worth, a sense that I am present to another, and they to me, in ways that are mutually affirming, respectful, and understanding. It affirms a sense of belonging, which is vitally important for every human being. You could put it in a rather different way by saying that the experience of a shared culture is in some ways, for some people at least, an experience of grace, in the sense that it's a common background you don't have to earn or work for. It's a set of meanings that you don't have to make up for yourself out of nothing. And at that most basic level, of course, culture is about the unself-conscious connections that bind us to one another. And a lot of the problems we think about in relation to culture have to do with what happens when it stops being quite so unself-conscious. But more of that in a while. So, in a nutshell, that's my starting point. Thinking about cultures as sets of recognition skills. Skills which have an obvious practical purpose because we want to do things together and we need to be able to rely on the fact that we'll be understood by each other. But running deeper than that, skills that allow us to make sense of ourselves and one another, to know that we are made sense of before we struggle, before we have to work it all out. We don't have to carve out our identity just by our own individual will. Something is given and shared, which is foundational for human dignity, what I called worth and presence and belonging, all those things. Now, if we approach culture overall in that kind of way, it should be fairly obvious from the start that cultures are going to be fluid. It's not that at the beginning of time, a whole set of identities is dropped from heaven upon us and never negotiated, never altered. If culture is about what we need to work together, then of course, as the tasks change and as an environment changes, so does culture, and language as part of culture. And in the human world, we know real communities jostle against each other, they overlap, they converge, they diverge. They modify one another. And here again is a little nugget from Eliot, who says that history judges the health of a culture in part by how it manages to affect and enrich neighboring cultures. I'm very happy to say that he mentions that in context with the survival of the Welsh language. So that cultures impact upon one another is not some early 21st century discovery of apocalyptic significance. Cultures have always adjusted because the tasks vary, and therefore kinds of belonging vary. A new kind of task creates a new kind of culture, which is why, of course, with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism, industrial capitalism in the 19th century, you see a new kind of laboring class culture emerging in most of the Western world, where people from very diverse backgrounds, ethnic and social, are put into a melting pot where there are new constraints, new jobs, and therefore new connections. And you can quite reasonably talk about the emergence in the 19th century of something like a coherent working class culture, let's say in the north of England, even where people are coming from what are originally culturally diverse backgrounds. You can see it, if I can talk about Wales again, you can see it in the way in which in the Welsh valleys during that period, people from different parts of Wales with different kinds of religious, social and political conviction were blended in with some incomers from England looking for work, with a large number of Irish migrants looking for work, and something emerged which made the industrial culture of the South Wales valleys something very different from the culture of rural West Wales. And being autobiographical for a moment, one of the most interesting things I find about the context in which I grew up in Wales is what it was like living very much on the frontier between industrial culture and older agricultural culture in the upper parts of the South Wales valleys. But that's another story. The point is, though, we must be very cautious about absolutizing, immobilizing, freezing the idea of culture. Historically speaking, because new kinds of solidarity emerge in the face of new kinds of task, cultures will shift and overlap and, yes, affect one another. Now, it is, as I say, a temptation to essentialize culture, to think that somewhere there must be a level of cultural purity in the identity of a community to which you can return, which can be restored by purging alien elements or rewinding history, tolling the bell backwards, as T.S. Eliot says in one of his greatest poems. What's behind this? Sometimes when you see reports in the press about complaints of cultural appropriation, people will say precisely what I've just said. Oh, cultures are always overlapping, always converging. Cultural appropriation is just another of those fashionable grievances people want to talk about. But I'm not so sure. I want to listen a bit more carefully to what's being said. It's true that there are ways of talking about cultural appropriation, that is, the transfer of cultural symbols from one setting to another, from their home territory to another territory. There are ways of talking about it which do sometimes carry the implication, oh, there is a genuine culture X, where all the signs really belong and you can't borrow them. But if we look at what's really going on, we see that in this instance it's largely to do with issues around power. That's to say, people find cultural appropriation offensive and difficult when those historically in positions of power take symbols from another culture to decorate their own mental worlds, their own imaginative worlds, without much in the way of acknowledgement, and as part of a wider program of silencing, suppressing, or disadvantaging a subordinate culture. There's a very powerful example in a play by that greatest of Nigerian poets and playwrights, Wole Soyinka, a play called Death and the King's Horseman. One of the key episodes in that play involves a rather dim-witted colonial administrator in Nigeria and his wife turning up to a reception wearing what they think is native dress. And the offensiveness of this is that what they're wearing is in fact something with highly specific and highly charged meanings in the culture around them. They haven't taken the trouble to look or listen to see what those meanings are. And all they're doing is treating the raw material of the ambient culture as something upon which they can draw for their entertainment, not even their cultural enrichment, but simply their entertainment. And I think that sort of example ought to give us pause before we write off this question of cultural appropriation, because cultures in our world don't always start on an equal footing. And there are ways of interrelation between cultures that can be oppressive and exploitative. And I think that's what Soyinka and many others are saying in this connection. Yet I do want to come back to that fundamental problem about what I called freezing the idea of culture. This is our culture, and it hasn't changed, or if it has, that change must be stopped or reversed, because there is something that is purely, originally, and without compromise, ours. Never as simple as that. And to recognize that without simply reducing historical, cultural externals to decorative, transferable things, that's quite a difficult task in managing cultural interrelation. So, my second point, having started with that picture of culture as a means of recognition, my second point is precisely to focus on that highly significant element of cultural life, which is about fusion, recreation, the emergence of cross-cultural forms or new cultural forms. And that, it seems to me, is something we ought to be able to recognize without panic, without retreat into cultural silos or ghettos, while at the same time being attentive to the particular histories that feed in to that moment of meeting, impact, and exchange, and being sensitive also to the massive imbalances in power which can be involved in insensitive, exploitative cultural relation. So if cultures change as the task changes, to use the language I used a while ago, if cultures change because there are different sorts of things we find ourselves doing together, is there anything we can excavate that is somehow fundamental in culture itself? I've said earlier that it's not just a matter of the practical usefulness of knowing that other people understand what you're saying. It's also about affirmation, about belonging. But that means that within the life of any culture, a very significant part of what's going on is what the Germans call Bildung, formation. Something is being shaped, or rather someone is being shaped. Growing up within a culture is not simply learning about performing tasks together. It's also, with more or less explicitness, learning what kind of human being you can be in this environment. And one can see all the variants of local and specific culture as somehow framed within that overall task. A culture is something within which you grow. A culture is something within which you learn how to exist, how to negotiate your environment, how to be counted within your society. And this, of course, is where a new set of problems and issues may arise. If we're looking for cultures to deliver various pictures of livable lives, intelligible lives, imitable lives, lives worth following, then again, there's going to be an element of fluidity, an element of change, convergence and divergence within all that. And there's going to be a certain degree of tension within that. And the question is whether that tension between different models of the formation of human beings, whether that tension is a creative, constructive one, or a rivalrous and destructive one. Yet again, I turn to Eliot, who has a couple of interesting pages on what he calls the need for constructive friction within societies. Eliot, perhaps rather surprisingly for 1948, does understand quite well that a national culture may at the same time be, at one level, multicultural, that multicultural identity will be a matter of friction, that there will be differences that are hard to manage, understand, or contain. But he wants us not to panic about that, because he believes that friction helps us ask ourselves necessarily fresh and necessarily awkward questions about who we are together. And that has to be good for the long-term well-being of a complex society. So he certainly doesn't see the answer to this as a zero-sum game, as if a cohesive and stable national culture, let's say, had to be one which had eradicated its competitors or homogenized its citizens. And he uses the phrase which in 2021 has a whole lot of extra resonance about the ecology of cultures. That is the difference of cultures in a complex society, needing a great deal of thought and patience about finding a natural balance, finding a kind of equilibrium of interaction, which doesn't suppress or demean or dehumanize. And that's one of those points where, for all the highly dated quality of so much of this work by Eliot, he does seem to have something to say into our own complex society and our own attempts to think, not only nationally but globally, about what a global ecology might be. And just as in the ecology of the natural world, conservation is important, attention to the full range of what a habitat involves is important, and there's certainly no intention of ironing out local difference. So, says Eliot, so in the global and the national setting, being strongly aware of particular historical and linguistic roots, practices, rhythms, and customs is not the opposite of social harmony, cohesion, or justice. But this takes me, fourthly, to one of Eliot's most central and most controversial points. Very early on in his notes on the definition of culture, Eliot says bluntly that he can't imagine culture existing without religion. And in the rest of the book, he has a lot of argument about the way in which the religious phenomenon, broadly speaking, is woven in and out of culture in ways that make it really inextricable. He says it's a great mistake to think that culture and religion live side by side, that there is something called culture and something called religion, and they have to be brought into the right relation with each other. Equally, he says, when religion and culture become indistinguishable, something has gone wrong. So at one end of the spectrum, you might say, is the ideal that some people have of a society in which religion is entirely a matter of individual choice to be practiced behind locked doors. At the other end of the spectrum is the phenomenon, sadly all too familiar, of associating a particular kind of nationalist fervour with faith in order to be a, what should one say, an American in certain contexts, a Serb, a Romanian, an Italian. You have to be a Protestant, an Orthodox, or a Catholic. And you can't really belong in the culture unless you belong in the religion. So those are the two ends of the spectrum, the two mistakes. And what Eliot is trying to find a way of saying is that as cultures develop, systems of doing things together, skills of mutual recognition, part of that always has to do with our relation not just with one another, but with that total environment which is more than society, which is the divine or the sacred. In other words, as cultures develop, it seems they also develop, rather curiously, a kind of self-critical element which says you may be loyal to this culture, this nation, this history, but that's never going to be all that you're loyal to. There is some other level of connection, some other level of responsibility, which is not exhausted by your belonging to this social group or this history. Now, I think it's fair to say that Eliot doesn't entirely sort this out, that there are confusions and gaps in the argument, and as one critic said of his essay, the last couple of chapters read as if they've been put together rather hastily, as if Eliot is rather bored with it. But the connection of culture and religion is sufficiently central, I think, to give us something to think about as we reflect on the definitions of culture now. And to my mind, that is most deeply to do with this idea of formation, of Bildung. Culture as something which shapes what it is to be a human being. Absent that dimension of culture, and we have a thin, potentially dangerous, potentially destructive set of loyalties, cultural signals, forms of belonging, which never quite get beyond that level of mutual recognition and mutual affirmation, often at the expense of those who don't share the culture and who don't know the signals. So I believe that Eliot is putting a genuine question to us here. If we want to understand how religion and culture interact and interweave, we have to recognize that how people understand human formation, the process of growing up as a human being, how we understand that is historically and at the present time, for the vast majority of human beings, heavily shaped by that sense of relating to the sacred, not just to one another or to an immediate set of problems and challenges. And if you were to remove that element from culture, if you were to try to imagine a culture wholly immanent, entirely about the skills of mutual recognition and no more, you would perhaps end up, Eliot would say, you would certainly end up with a kind of human ideal that was more static, more self-referential, and at the end of the day, more liable to violence than if that other dimension were present. People regularly say, of course, that religion is a driver of cultural difference and cultural conflict. And in many environments, that is sadly and undeniably true. And yet, if one looks at the work done on this kind of subject by scholars like the late lamented David Martin in this country, or by some others like William Kavanagh in the United States, you'll see that the picture is more complex. Cultures can instrumentalize religion to try and reinforce, even cement their positions. Sometimes it is religious discourse that unsettles the self-satisfaction or self-shutting of cultural phenomena, cultural communities. Eliot wants us to try to understand that although diverse cultures in tension can still produce common disciplines and common ideals of human formation and human nature, the more fragmented and the more secular those cultures are, the more difficult it is for a common sense of Bildung, formation, growth into some kind of recognizable humanity, the harder it is for that to happen. And where cultures are systematically deprived of the possibilities of intelligent engagement, thoughtful change, when they're not confident of being taken seriously and attended to by those with more power, this drives a downward spiral. There is an erosion of common purpose, the telos of human being. And you end up simply with a static diversity. You end up with precisely the silo situation that has already been mentioned. Groups who know how to recognize one another, but don't know how to recognize any other group. Groups which, because they are focused on a particular kind of short-term survival under pressure, don't feel the strength or the vision to take the risk of becoming different in engagement with others. There's a recent book by the very creative young scholar James Mumford called Vexatious, which looks at what he calls the tribalizing of ethics in our time. He notes the way in which many groups have, so to speak, settled for a package deal in ethics. Because of their political and social allegiances, there is a simple set of ethical conclusions that they feel they all must come to and share. It's probably a phenomenon rather more evident in the United States than it is here. But the point that Mumford is trying to make is that you end up with a set of ethical ideals which have very little intrinsic connection with one another, and yet are passionately held, sometimes violently promoted, because they are part of a subcultural identity which demands unanimity on these moral questions. To give the obvious example, those in the United States with car stickers saying pro-life, pro-guns, pro-God might well be an example of this kind of package deal, because those three are not all that easy to distill into a coherent moral program. The point is that where something of the genuine religious element in culture has been lost, then for all the religious noises that may be made in some settings, what actually emerges is a highly secular culture with no sense of responsibility to what is more than the group you belong to. And that is one of the features of social life in a society dominated by one particular kind of pseudo-culture, which is, of course, the market. That is the environment in which our relations to one another, our recognizability to one another, our seriousness in the eyes of one another essentially depends on disposable consuming power. And when that erodes other kinds of solidarity, and when its preservation erodes attention to and indeed compassion for communities at other levels, it's not entirely surprising that we have a weakened or trivialized sense of how culture works. And so to come to my last point, the question for all of us who are interested in the interactions of religious discourse with the wider culture, the question is how we as communities of faith somehow present and witness to that notion of formation, that notion of moving towards a fuller, more interactive humanity in an environment where very many of the pressures around us are homogenizing and flattening, not flattening in a properly egalitarian way, but flattening in a sense of producing the infinitely exchangeable realities of capitalist economics. And that's where, of course, it's important that there be an alliance between religious thinking and discourse and those imaginative discourses that try to keep alive the sense of the three-dimensionally human in this world. In plainer English, that's the point at which theology and the arts have to be talking to each other as vigorously as they can. Not because theology has an interest in the life of the imagination as such, though it does, but especially because in the kind of world we're in, where culture is so often misunderstood, misapplied, and weaponized, it matters to work at what it is that might, in our day, represent the common task of human formation. And that's certainly where we need the life of the imagination as a political necessity, not simply as the icing on the cake. It's why, to put it in its contemporary, immediate contemporary setting, that's why the restoration of artistic activity and institutions in this country after the pandemic is not a matter of luxury goods, but a matter of social and political health. And I'm suggesting that religious communities and practitioners of religious discourse need to be in the forefront of advocacy there, listening, engaging, and speaking, reminding the culture around us that we do have some things to say about building, about formation, that we do have some things to say about what a fulfilled, self-aware humanity might look like. We do have some things to say about why it is that there is no human subject and no human environment which can be forgotten or ruled out from the processes of mutual learning and mutual nourishment. But there's always something of a catch here. I mentioned early on that culture, as I've been using the word, is initially, primordially, unself-conscious, just as tradition is unself-conscious. We pass on ways of understanding, ways of belonging and relating to one another. And it seems often the more we think about them, the harder it gets. We are certainly in an environment where self-consciousness about culture can be crippling and unconstructive, where the affirmation of cultures can be dictated by, shaped by rivalry, anxiety, the fear of otherness and difference. There's no way back to an unself-conscious world, and it's been said, you might say, too often to bear repeating, that the difference between tradition and traditionalism is that tradition is what you don't have to think about, and traditionalism is an option you have decided for after thinking about it. So, how do we build a renewed sense of a shared task, a renewed sense of how the performance of shared tasks can illuminate as between different groups? How do we hold up in this context a sense of a human goal, a life well lived, what I called an intelligible and imitable kind of life? Well, we as Christians, others from their own religious traditions, will be able to do it because they have a repertoire of narratives that can be brought to bear on this. And we need to be unashamed about sharing those narratives. As I've said, we're not looking for cultural victory. Not even, I would say, for the re-Christianizing of culture in the sense that some would want to see. We are, I believe, working towards what indeed seems quite remote at the moment, and that is a context in which religious discourse can do the job which many believe it's meant to do. That is, to probe, extend, challenge, and sometimes strengthen those visions of the human which take the scope and the dignity of the human beyond just what any society or any local culture confers, and remind all of us of our answerability to something beyond all that, something beyond negotiation, earning, success, and all the rest of it. How we're going to do that is something I wish I knew, and I guess most of my audience will share that feeling. But my purpose in these brief remarks has just been to attempt a very rough and ready account of how the word is being used, what the logic of its use might be, some of the risks that attend its use today, and some of the ways in which we might think about the interpenetration of language about culture and language about religion in order to restore something of that sense of common human purpose and even common human good, which is so deeply under threat in a world which is marketized, polarized, and in very many ways driving towards a less than human future. There is everything to resist in that process, but there are resources for resistance. Thanks very much for listening patiently.